Congregation, we come this morning with the Lord's help to 1 Corinthians 13, and a great chapter on love. 1 Corinthians 13 it really begins in chapter 12 at verse 31. And it comes after this chapter on gifts. As most of you know, Corinth was one of the early churches, and it had a lot of problems and a lot of questions. And so Paul, in the first epistle to the Corinthians, deals with both their questions and with many of their problems. One of the questions it seems that they asked him about was gifts, how to properly use gifts in the church. And so we see in chapter 12 that Paul talks about the gift of tongues, the gift of prophecy, the gifts of healing, many other different gifts. And these are gifts of the Holy Spirit. That makes them very important. They're not a small topic. And in chapter 14, Paul actually goes back to this topic of the gifts of the Holy Spirit, how to use the gifts of prophecy and the gifts of tongues in particular. But in the middle of it all, Paul seems to take a break from this topic of gifts and to turn to something so much more important than gifts. And these gifts are important. And that's the topic of 1 Corinthians 13. It's the topic of love. Paul turns to it in verse 31 of chapter 12. He takes a break from talking about gifts for a moment. He says, "But covet earnestly the best gifts. So desire these things." These are important things. "And yet I show unto you a more excellent way," something more important, something much greater.